you, everyone. This was an incredible. It's not on? Thank you. This was a really incredibly fascinating panel. So thank you to everyone. I think I'll start out with a few questions and we'll open it up to the audience. I want to take a question that's a little bit similar to what Efrat asked this morning about positive deviance. We learned in the course this week about positive deviance and how to take what you're doing and make it better. And how do we learn from what we're doing better? How do we learn from what we're doing to improve it? Where are our successes and how can we replicate them in other places? So I think I'd like to start out on a positive note and find out from you in your individual cases, what are one or two things that you found very successful that you can take on as an example for your own project or for other projects later on?
Sorry, do you mean to take on from other ideas that at the conference today? Or?
No, from your own success.
Oh, from the other experience. Well, one of the things that, because we visit farmers really throughout the entire region, I often find a practice that's quite interesting that I will take and test in other areas. And once in Madagascar, they do a lot of rotation, for instance, with sweet potato and rice. And so I took that information back to Uganda, and we actually ran a trial and experiments. And we actually found out that that practice in these irrigation schemes were a win-win for both the rice and for the sweet potato, because they didn't have sufficient water to do a second rice crop efficiently, but that gave us planting material of the sweet potato ready for the rainy season. And it turned out that the sweet potato being in the system ended up breaking up the soil and reducing the weeding necessity for the rice crop in the following season. So the total economic return was higher. So I often find by seeing what farmers are doing in other countries, I can take that back to a new situation and apply it.
So I'm a researcher. Usually we don't implement interventions. So every time we learn something, I consider it to be a success, whether it studies an attempt that was successful or not, because every time we do that, we learn something. And learning is very important, especially in this domain. So I appreciate the fact that Tammy also spoke about failures, because typically nobody likes to tell about their failures. And I think that really impedes our ability to learn more about how to do things right. It's a very challenging environment to work in, and so if we don't learn from our failures, it'll be hard to make progress. So as a researcher, I think it's always nicer to discover successes, and I think part of our job is to identify those initiatives or policies or interventions that succeed and really make sure they really succeed and tell the world about it. But also to learn from failures. That, from a knowledge creation point of view, that's important and that always has value.
It's working? You hear me? Okay. I agree. I think I've learned through successes, but I've learned even more through the failures or through I don't even want to say failures, let's just say the challenges or the difficult moments. And I think one of the things that I would definitely take and definitely encourage anyone working in development to take is the cultural sensitivity, because again, I think everyone here kind of spoke about how we bring technologies or how we bring know-how, or Hily earlier said, okay, so here we have people in one country that are supposed to or want to design something for people in an entirely other country. And so we have all of this vast knowledge about the technicalities or the steps or the literature, but actually when you get down on the ground and you start working, you realize that when you're working with people, then the cultural or the mental or the social aspects are not less important. So that's one of the things that I would take, definitely.
I'm looking at it from the business sector. So if you don't do your due diligence, you're probably not going to succeed. So you better learn from the companies that failed and why they failed. You definitely want to know those who succeeded, why they succeeded. If you're looking at anything from business models to what the value proposition is for your product and why somebody would want to buy it. So I guess, you know, oh, and there's a, sorry? And there's also a great model. It actually belongs to Ariel Berry, who created the 4 C's that said, do your environmental scanning, look for your collaborators, your comparatives, your competitives, and your complementaries. And that's the best way in order to find how good your product is.
If I can just add, I have a running battle with a couple of my food scientists. Because I won't build them a product development lab. I make them work with the private sector company as they're doing the product. And they said, but sometimes it's embarrassing, you know, it fails, you know, in front of them. And I said, but you're using their processes, their staff, their equipment. And therefore, when you get it to work, it's finally going to work in their conditions. And this is an issue I have. There are many incubation labs in Africa, and you just see their products sitting on the shelf. I say, if we start with the company, working inside the company, then we'll finally get something they'll actually do, because we're paying attention to what their limitations are in terms of the ingredients they can pay for, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, it makes it a little harder to write the research paper.
You know, one thing that Tammy brought up and is actually relevant for all of you is how to make the small farmer an entrepreneur. And I feel like that's a very, very big challenge, especially in the developing world, because, you know, we have an image of how we want things to be and how we feel, you know, their lives could be better or how to be more successful. But that might not necessarily be what they want to be doing. How do you deal with that challenge of you know, the small farmer as an entrepreneur or not, as far as the projects are concerned?
I find that's a highly variable question. That's often a lot of culture dependent and market access dependent. But we face a particular challenge because in our model or our mindsets, business usually comes with the idea of keeping records. And we work with a crop that I'd say is a predominantly female crop. And in many of our countries, we have pretty low literacy levels. And in fact, we found, because we tend to go in and do gender assessments periodically in our work, and I had my gender specialist come back and say, oh, Tanzania, you really mucked up all the multipliers are men. And we came back after a year and we said, yeah, you're right, and it was because of our literacy requirement that they had to keep records. So that made us be a little more innovative, and we started making it a family enterprise and bringing in the children to help with the record keeping, because it turned out that the women were actually very good multipliers in terms of taking care of the crop. So it is a challenge because we have preconceived notions of what is a business, and in our mind, if you aren't keeping track of your profits and your sales, you can't really develop that business mentality. So I think first of all, it's focusing on the next generation. Let's use our resources wisely, because not everybody's going to become that kind of business model that we imagine. And then some people can keep track of things in their head. They may not be carrying them in monetary terms, but they're carrying them in, I know whether this may be money because I still have some cash to do something for the next round. So we have to be more open to different models, particularly I think when we're working with our smallholder women farmers.
I don't really...
They don't need to be entrepreneurs.
I don't think the problem is whether farmers are entrepreneurial or not. I think they would be entrepreneurial if they worked and lived in an environment that would encourage that. I think the problem is not the farmers, the problem is the environment in which they work, based on my experience. I don't claim to understand what these farmers are going through, but my feeling from almost every farmer I met was that the views of often people say it's a culture issue, it's lack of motivation, lack of entrepreneurial spirit. And I see Hani nodding her head. She knows many farmers. I don't think I think any of us, if we had to work in that environment, we would be anything but entrepreneurial. We would not be entrepreneurial. And being entrepreneurial in a very difficult environment that does not encourage or reward entrepreneurship is the problem.
Yes, I think first of all, as Jan said, when you're working with different kinds of groups of people from different backgrounds, there isn't one recipe to work with them. But we try to address the issue in two different ways. The first one is that, and this was the lesson that we learned from Koryaba, and that you need to not only teach the skills directly related to agriculture, but also the skills around that, and including group organization, group work, and including different entrepreneurship or business management. But even more so, I would say, we introduced into our program literacy courses. Because again, a lot of our recipients were women, but not just women, any groups that didn't have and that were illiterate. The second way we addressed it was the fact that because we were working with groups and through group effort, we sort of gave it up to the group to decide if they're going to do joint marketing or individual marketing. And in that way, individuals who are not maybe entrepreneurially inclined or don't have a good business head, let's say, they can be supported by the group effort as well. And the committee that is in charge of marketing is composed of people who really feel that they have that kind of a skill or that kind of a drive, or they want to develop more knowledge in that field and help others.
Just one sentence. I think the problem is that we are not being entrepreneurial, not that the farmers are not entrepreneurial. We're not coming up with solutions. Why aren't there 10 times more companies, innovators, trying to benefit from the programs that you described? Yeah. Right. So, but that's the real problem, not the farmers being not entrepreneurial.
Can you guess how many startups in Israel are relevant for emerging markets? Not exact. Throw a number. 50% of the startups, we have over 5,000. In agriculture. Agriculture. Sorry? Several hundreds, 50? I'm going to say that probably 50, 60 startups may be relevant for emerging markets from the startups in Israel. We have about 450 startups in the ag space, and that's more or less the number.
I'm going to open it up for some questions from the audience. Start with Danny.
I want to compare and contrast, if possible, Ram and Jan, because Jan, you talked about a major success in sub-Saharan Africa, and Ram, you talked about a major failure in sub-Saharan Africa, that we haven't been able to get sub-Saharan African farmers to adopt the Green Revolution. So what can, is it hopeless, or what needs to be done if you look at these two different paradigms? Why, Jan, you were, with this very specific project, so successful, but when we look at the agriculture in general, the Green Revolution, it's been a disaster.
I'll just repeat the question quickly. Why is the Green Revolution failing and succeeding according to both of you?
At the same time.
Well, I think, as Ram said, there are many aspects of the Green Revolution that were a success in terms of increased food output for a lot of people. I do think, I'm coming from a very different perspective in the sense that, whether we're a major success or not, it all depends on how you define major, but I think we still have a long way to go. But, we were introducing an improved variety and knowledge products. Because of the nature of the crop I'm working with, farmers traditionally have not been using inputs. So we haven't been engaging in trying to get fertilizer use up or other use. We've been engaging in the yield gains we can get with quality, seed management. So probably simpler entry points, and really, and I always say I'm blessed to be able to work on sweet potato because the private companies don't care about it. It's an easy technology to share, so you don't have anybody fighting over hybrid seed or who's controlling the market. Because it's really a women's-based technology, we've been able to move forward with basically no hindrance from the policymakers. It's actually convincing the policymakers they should pay some attention to it because it can make a difference in terms of human nutrition. So it's, I think it's a whole different perspective than what they're dealing with in the high agriculture output sector in India.
I don't think anybody knows for sure why there was no green revolution in Africa, and it's a topic of debate, I think. But one of the explanations is that people bring up is that the crops that are most commonly grown in sub-Saharan Africa were not the subject of sufficient innovation. It started with wheat and then rice in the Philippines, and those were easier to bring to places like India and China. They were not so easy to bring into Africa. And Jen is working on a crop that was neglected by a lot of the activities. So maybe that's part of the reason. She's doing something that's much more sensitive to the local needs in sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, and I think people are saying, the agroecological environment is completely different. I think you had one variety, IR8, that could be grown across a swath of Asia. And, we have much more diverse environments that require a lot more locally specific breeding. One of the hardest things we had to do was raise money for actually breeding in Africa for Africa. We moved from 2 breeding programs in 2 countries to 12 in the last 8 years. And without those breeding programs, you don't get the locally adapted varieties. And without the locally adapted varieties, you don't get the impact. But convincing people to invest in breeding because it's a longer term issue is a challenging thing to do. And I think there's still, except perhaps for maize, severe underinvestment in breeding for the agroecological conditions we have.
Funding is actually going down.
And funding is going down again, yeah. Sure.
Our representatives from the different African countries, what do you say from your experience and from your knowledge about the Green Revolution in Africa? Do you have any thoughts about it?
No pressure.
Wait, the microphone is coming.
Good evening, my name is Sarah, and I'm representing Kenya. I have worked previously with farmers also in the central uplands of Kenya, and the biggest problem is that we adapted farming systems from our grandfathers, who adapted it from their grandfathers, and this has been feeding us for a long time. So it has been difficult for us to take in the new technology. And I see what NGOs come and do. They bring a project for maybe 6 months. They try to explain to you about its profitability. And then after 6 months, they disappear. They go back to their countries. They are not coming to follow up to see if the project was sustainable enough. And because many smallholder farmers don't have enough funds to fund the projects they are bringing in, they go back to what they learned from their grandfathers, which is much cheaper. So that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Wait, I just want to say something about that. You said Sarah is your name? Yes. The problem is that, yes, farming is a traditional activity, and for many generations it was working. But today, with climate change, with the different problems that we have, the environmental problems, the various political problems, people cannot continue farming as their fathers and forefathers have done. They're not going to receive the same yields, even if they say, leave me alone with your projects, leave me alone with your innovations. We've lived like this in peace, and we've succeeded for generations, but today they can no longer do that, I think.
You know, and if you look at the history of the Green Revolution, when those new varieties were released, they had Swaminathan, they had true leadership in India. They had public sector extension systems. In the 80s and early 90s, under IMF stress, they were told, let the private sector take care of it. Markets will do the job. You don't really need to invest in these inefficient systems. And I work in many countries where we have one extension agent for 100,000 farmers. So how do you get technologies out? You don't realize how much you depend on public sector extension until it's not there to work with. And I think she made a very valid point. Many NGOs are there for short periods of time. They'll have extension systems for those short periods of time. But really that consistent, I can see the difference we make in countries where we have public sector counterparts to work with, and what we're able to achieve is much faster and much more accelerated than in countries where we're really, basically you're going in and you're starting at ground zero, so we have to build up farmer networks that are in essence substitute extension systems.
Is it scalable though?
And it takes time, and it takes time to scale, a lot of time to scale.
8 projects in 12 years, would you consider that like scalable? I was asking about, it's not here.
Oh, it's
Oh, sorry, I stole your money.
I'm asking about the scaling. So keeping NGOs for longer, long-term investment, creating talent, everything you're saying is completely valid. Is it scalable? There's so many people doing good work, but the 12 projects, 8 years. How many farmers have you reached with 12 projects? How many, what's your reach with 12 projects?
This is, you're right, scalability, it takes time, and this is the great problem when you don't have an extension system that you can build into easily. So right now we're at 4.5 million across the 10 countries.
Great.
But that's, we could be at much more if we had systems to build into, but there's still much more to do. And you're right, you have to raise money for all of that. And so this is the conundrum of getting technologies out. I believe in public goods, and I think public sector extension has a true role to play in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where it's very difficult for farmers to pay for services.
I want to take one last question from Eliza before we finish our discussion.
So I'll stand so you can hear me better, because you probably can't even see me if I'm sitting. So Tammy, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation, because I thought it was extremely interesting and extremely informative, because really, like everyone has said, you learn so much more from challenges as a rule than you do learn from successes. Deep in my heart of hearts, I'm an innovator. So I hear a problem, and then I spend I can't get the problem out of my mind and start thinking, okay, well, but what's the solution to the problem? So here's the question. What I understood from what you presented was as follows, is that you brought a project to a region where you had all of this knowledge and know-how and technology that, empirically speaking, could have improved yields, improved livelihoods, dealt with different climate stressors and so on and so forth, and helped put this farming community on its feet economically, et cetera. And so you brought these great free goods and you offered them to the community, and the community were with you as long as they didn't have to actually, do all that much to make it happen. And then when you were talking to them about, well, paying for water or so on or so forth, you found that there wasn't a lot of willingness to actually invest in this, which would seem to suggest a limited amount of buy-in for whatever reason. Now, then what you said is, but there were a few people that did buy it, that said, wow, this is amazing, we should really be doing this, and then they took their own initiative and they did it. So here's my question. Now that you've gone through this, and this is a question for you, but also for anyone else in the panel that has ideas, because now I need to find the solution. Now that you've done this, do you think that there are ways you could have built the project differently a priori so that you would have somehow managed to identify the champions to begin with and started by working with them rather than with everyone and somehow, and could that have somehow brought to different results?
Okay, thank you. I think you gave the answer in your question already, maybe having brought over the champions first. And in fact, we discovered who they were afterwards when the project failed. But in fact, if we would have done some work to identify these leaders, these champions, these people who are ready to take chances, ready to innovate, ready to adopt, and maybe put them in the center to begin with, maybe the project would have ended up different in this case. But the thing is that the first TPAs that we did were, in fact, I think they were experimental, basically. And so we learned a lot from them, and I think the main thing was the trust and the relationship that you have with the community to begin with is the basis. And I think maybe that's one of the things that we would have done differently.
So I think we're going to end here. Thank you, everyone. And
One more question in the back.
We actually are way over time. I'm sorry. So you can come and ask your questions once we're finished. I invite Professor Nirahat to come and conclude our conference.
So I'm going to do it really brief. We have a saying in Hebrew which says, if you've saved one soul, it is as if you've saved the whole world. And I think the aim of what we're doing here today is that whatever notes you wrote in your brain, on your notepad, on your notebook, the business cards you've exchanged, the ideas that you took, and the new connections that you may have made today that will enhance food security is the entire purpose of this meeting. And this is, I hope, what you've gained from today. We've started from the, we haven't started, but we did touch upon the end user, the consumer, and we also started with or touched upon the farmer and then part of the entire range. And you've seen how complex it is, but how much we need to interact with each other in order to allow, to improve this entire process. And this is what it's all about. So I would like to thank our international guests for coming here, taking the time and sharing their knowledge. Thank you so much. And again, it's 4 o'clock at the 4th of July, so it's really a party for them and for us. I'd also like to thank the students that came to help us on this event. We have volunteer students. It's Julie, Cynthia, Eliana, and Shelly. Thank you so much. All our partners, both from inside the university, the Boris Mintz Institute, and the external entities, all the people and lecturers that came from other universities, the government, the extensions, the ministries. Thank you so much. And last and not least, our students. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our master students from the Arava program from ICAT and Tel Aviv shared program, and our international students from all over the world who take part here. And I hope we're enjoying this meeting and taking knowledge and ideas, and of course our Israeli students who joined this wonderful program. Thank you all, and have a safe trip home.